Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I'm going to devote most of my time for questions to the Minister and hoping a few answers in the process. And I would ask the Chair respectfully to give me some updates on my time because I understand I have 15 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Minister, it's good to see you here tonight. In your opening remarks in response to questions from my colleague, the MP from Milton, you mentioned that as Minister, you've asked your department, the Department of Justice, to do an overview to ensure you met obligations with respect to disclosure in the Admiral Mark Norman matter. Is that correct? Did I hear you properly?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
The actual detail is that I was briefed on the Norman matter. I remind my colleague and thank him for the question that there was document disclosure as between the prosecution and the defense in this matter. My department only was involved with respect to third-party record applications. We set up a process in order to meet those obligations to the court. And I was satisfied after that briefing from my department, Mr. Speaker, that we were maintaining, we had begun and we were maintaining a rigorous procedure to try to get through these complex decisions.
Before we go to the next question, just a reminder to all members, while Committee of the Whole is a little bit less formal, we still ask members to direct their questions through the chair and use the third person in the usual fashion, but there's some informality here and we'll allow some latitude. The Honourable Member for Durham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I understand from the Minister's comments that he feels that his department met their obligations with respect to the report. I'd ask the Minister if he could table the report they provided with respect to disclosure obligations.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it was part of an oral briefing.
The Honourable Member for Durham.
Mr. Chair, oral briefing. Mr. Chair, I could ask the Minister what his code name is, but I won't, I won't do that. I would like, Mr. Chair, for the benefit of Canadians, the Committee of the Whole, for them to get an understanding. As our Chief Legal Officer, the Minister of Justice, is responsible for all lawyers in the federal government. I'd ask the Minister, through you, Mr. Chair, to confirm that as the Chief Legal Officer, all of the lawyers in the federal government are under his mandate.
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, that's true as Attorney General for Canada.
The Honourable Member for Durham.
So, Mr. Chair, as Attorney General responsible for all lawyers, I'd like to know what Privy Council lawyer Paul Shuttle meant when he used the term in communications with the prosecution in the Norman matter that he wanted to, quote, engineer the issues at stake. Could the Minister, as Chief Legal Officer, explain what the engineering of issues in the Mark Norman matter referred to?
Excellent.
Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, that lawyer, I believe, is part of the legal team for the Privy Council office, which serves the Prime Minister.
The Honourable Member for Durham.
So, Mr. Chair, I'd like the Chief Legal Officer of our country to now clarify that there are lawyers that he's now appearing to suggest do not work for him. Could he clarify, are all lawyers, including Privy Council advisors to the Prime Minister, lawyers in that capacity, under his purview as Minister?
Yeah.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
I believe my understanding is all lawyers in the Justice Department are, but not all lawyers in the government.
The Honourable Member for Durham.
As Chief Legal Officer for the country, Mr. Chair, does the Minister think it's appropriate that lawyers in the Privy Council were communicating with the Director of Public Prosecution with respect to trial strategy?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not prepared to accept the premise of that question, and I have no comment on it.
Honourable Member.
Mr. Chair, I quote, "So much for the independence of the public prosecution of Canada." End quote, Mr. Speaker. That's not my quote, Mr. Chair. That's the quote of Justice Perkins McVeigh, the judge in the Norman trial. Does the comment from the judge who was presiding over the trial before the charges were stayed, does that concern him as Minister, and does he feel an oral report to him is sufficient to look into that?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, as I've described in a previous line of questioning, The Department of Justice set up a procedure with the court in order to fulfill its third-party records obligations. That's all the Department of Justice was doing in this case, Mr. Speaker. We identified over 140,000 potentially relevant documents in a variety of different places. That number was boiled down to 8,000, Mr. Speaker. And then ultimately a judge was going to, working through a civil servant in PCO, ultimately a judge was going to determine both the relevancy of the documents and whether they would be subject to privilege of any sort, be it solicitor-client, cabinet confidence, or other.
5 minutes has lapsed, 10 minutes remaining. The honourable member for Durham.
Mr. Chair, the judge the minister's referring to, Justice Perkins McVeigh, is the one I quoted. She had concerns about independence of the public prosecutor after she had seen notes that were not fully disclosed to the defense and were claimed under litigation privilege because they dealt with trial strategy. Does he feel it's appropriate, as our chief legal officer, for the Prime Minister's legal advisors to be communicating with Crown officials with respect to trial strategy?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, again, I don't accept the premise of the question. I point, Mr. Chair, the honourable member, to the statement by the Director of Public Prosecutions herself. On at least 2 occasions, she said that there was no political interference in the case, and the prosecutor in the case also said that.
The honourable member for Durham.
And Mr. Chair, on the February 11th pretrial dates, Defence Counsel Mainville was raising concerns about the non-disclosure of notes that appear related to trial strategy. This is where the quote, engineer issues at stake led to the exchange. Would the minister, if he's rejecting the premise of my question when I'm quoting a judge, Mr. Speaker, would he undertake to examine the concerns the judge had with respect to independence in his role as chief legal officer?
The Honourable Attorney General.
Mr. Speaker, I'm obviously not going to comment on trial strategies of whatever party is involved in a trial. It would be absurd for me to do that. What I will say, Mr. Speaker, is the Director of the Prosecution Service has stated on at least 2 occasions that there was no political interference, including for the staying of the decision, and that the prosecutor herself stated that there was no political interference.
The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So at the outset, the minister said all lawyers in the government were under his purview. When asked about the first one I mentioned, he clarified that not all of them are. Can he say whether the lawyers under his purview, whether any Department of Justice lawyers spoke with Paul Shuttle, the PCO legal advisor, about the Norman case?
The honourable minister.
Within the process, documents were turned over to PCO in order to determine whether they were covered by privilege, whether it be solicitor-client or cabinet privilege. This was a normal part of this process. I point out that the clerk of the Privy Council delegated the ultimate authority to make the decision on whether documents had to be produced or redacted to the judge, which is highly exceptional and I think evidence of our good faith in this matter.
The honourable member for Durham.
Mr. Chair, would the minister undertake to examine whether there were communications with any Department of Justice officials and Privy Council advisors to the Prime Minister on trial strategy in the Norman matter?
The honourable minister.
Once again, Mr. Speaker, I point out that the Director of Public Prosecutions has said that has been no political interference in this trial. Confident in the institutions like the RCMP and the Prosecution Service in Canada. Ultimately, very confident in our trial process, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Durham.
Mr. Chair, does the minister now consider litigation or the court case involving Admiral Norman to be complete?
The honourable minister.
Mr. Speaker, the prosecution has been stayed by the Director of Public Prosecutions. I will say no more than that. The honourable member is an attorney, and he knows what that means.
The honourable member for Durham.
Mr. Chair, I am indeed a lawyer, and I know what that means. So since litigation has been completed, will our Chief Legal Officer today agree to waive litigation privilege protections of the notes referred to at the February 11 matter involving PCO lawyer Paul Shuttle?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, there is currently another case proceeding through the courts based on the same set of facts, and I will do nothing, Mr. Speaker, to interfere with that case.
We're at 5 minutes remaining. The Honourable Member for Durham.
Mr. Chair, if the other litigation concludes, will the minister then agree to waive litigation privilege over those notes?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Chair, the honourable member knows that I will not answer that kind of hypothetical question.
The Honourable Member for Durham.
Well, Mr. Chair, moving from the sublime to the ridiculous, I'd like to remind the minister that he was appointed on January 14th. Congratulations belatedly, Minister. On January 17th, former Ambassador John McCallum appeared at Cabinet. Did the minister speak with John McCallum about the extradition case of Meng Wanzhou?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
That kind of conversation, Mr. Speaker, would be covered by Cabinet confidence.
Honourable Member.
I'll rephrase, Mr. Chair. I don't want to know the substance of the conversation. Will he acknowledge yes or no that a conversation on the Meng Wanzhou extradition took place with Ambassador McCallum?
The Honourable Minister.
Again, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to comment on that.
The Honourable Member for Durham.
That means yes.
Mr. Chair, I think people viewing would take that as a yes, as I do. Mr. McCallum, the former ambassador, I would note, is not a lawyer, but 4 or 5 days after meeting with Cabinet, he did a press conference saying Meng Wanzhou had strong legal arguments to fight against her extradition. Did the minister speak about those legal arguments with the ambassador?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Once again, Mr. Speaker, the honest answer is I actually have no recollection whether I spoke to him or not. So.
The Honourable Member for Durham.
I cannot recall.
Mr. Chair, clearly the Prime Minister asked for the resignation of Ambassador McCallum after he spoke publicly a few days after the Cabinet meeting about the substance of the Meng Wanzhou extradition case, which was highly inappropriate. On February 7th, the minister gave an interview to the Toronto Star where he said ultimately the extradition is in his hands. He said, quote, foreign affairs is a political matter, Mr. Speaker. Is he the final arbiter for the Meng Wanzhou extradition?
Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, as I've said a number of times publicly, there is a process, an extradition process that we have established in Canada, in which the process will go through the court system. Ultimately, at the end of all legal proceedings, if there is an extradition order, it is up to the Minister of Justice, in my role as Minister of Justice, according to established criteria, to order or not that extradition. What I was referring to in the Toronto Star interview, and I thank the honourable member for allowing me the time to clarify this, was that as Minister of Justice, and not as Attorney General in this particular role, it is ultimately a recognition that external affairs is of a different order of things. But there are legal criteria which I will follow, Mr. Chair, should we get to that point.
Time for 2 more questions. The Honourable Member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So as the final arbiter, as the minister mentioned, after the process has run its course, he will make a final determination in his role as Minister of Justice. So I'm wondering, a few days ago, the minister had dinner at the Orchid Ball in Montreal with the Consul General of China. Did the Meng Wanzhou case come up in his dinner with the ambassador?
Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, no, it did not. We talked to each other and we said that we would not talk about the case.
Durham.
Mr. Chair, did the minister make inquiries with respect to the legal rights of Michael Spavor, Michael Korvig, and the lack of access to justice that our own citizens have in that country?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, again, other parts of that, it was a social evening. It wasn't a formal meeting. I wasn't seated next to that person.